I stood there, all my emotions undone, unable to comprehend, my mind filled with questions that, surrounded by friends and family, I couldn't bring myself to ask. I was desperate to pretend too. Now, my hands covered my eyes and I stood holding my face. Living with the climate crisis was so like living with him. The stress and the fear, the constant risk of death, the building tension, the pressure and despair that impacts everything, underlies everything, the anxiety that kept me up at night. Violence was inevitable and would be inflicted on those least responsible. It was only a matter of time.
That was Brianna Craft reading from her memoir, Everything That Rises. Hi, I'm Alan Rose. Welcome to Book Chat. We're delighted to welcome back to Kelso Longview, Brianna. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real thrill.
Well, it's a thrill to have you. Your story is so powerful, or I should say stories. There are a couple of very powerful stories in this book, and I look forward to talking to you about them now.
Me too.
The key story, the main story, is about you becoming aware of climate change, the risk of climate change, and how you became actively involved in the effort. Can you talk about how your life and career evolved to this point?
Yeah, sure. So I'm from Kelso, and I went to undergrad in UW. So I went up to the University of Washington when I was 18. And when I was 19, I was sitting in a lecture hall in my first environmental studies class, and a professor started talking about this thing called climate change. And I had never heard of climate change before. And essentially him explaining it gave me a panic attack. I didn't realize human greenhouse gas emissions were causing the climate to change, and figuring that out just changed the whole course of my life. I'd gone to the University of Washington to study architecture. I was going to become an architect. I wanted to minor in environmental design, but that's because my parents lived in a passive solar house, and I thought that was quite cool and efficient. And then I heard about the climate crisis, and it changed my life.
And then you got a master's degree in environmental studies from Brown University.
Exactly.
And that sort of opened some doors, too.
Yes. So kind of by the time I had graduated from UW, I realized that for me there was no going back on the climate crisis. I did a year of AmeriCorps volunteering with environmental groups in Seattle and helping community groups with climate projects. And by the time I finished that, I knew that I wasn't going to become an architect, that I needed to switch and do whatever it is that people interested in climate change do. So went to Brown and thought I would get a degree and at least fully understand the science behind the climate crisis, the policy ideas about solving it, and figure out where I was going to fit in. And I just happened to put my hand up first one day in our climate lab and wound up in the UN climate negotiations, which is where my book begins, really.
And that was really an exciting and important time, about 2011.
Mm-hmm.
And you worked with the least developed countries group. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. So it was 2011, and my professor was in touch with a researcher in the International Institute for Environment and Development, which is a think tank in London. And she was on her way to South Africa for the UN climate negotiations, and she was going to assist the least developed countries group, which I had never heard of. And they needed an assistant, and my hand went up first. So I got to South Africa and got to meet these people and figure out that the least developed countries group is a group of 46 countries. They are classified by the UN as the poorest on earth. Most of them are in Africa, about 34 these days, but some are in Asia, the South Pacific, and the one least developed country in the Americas is Haiti. And all told, there are about 1 billion people living in the least developed countries, and most of them are sustenance farmers. They rely on rain-fed agriculture, and yeah, they also are a very dynamic group of negotiators in the UN, where they work together for climate solutions, because they are the least responsible for the climate crisis, but they are so impacted by it that they really come to the UN to demand solutions for this problem that they didn't make, but they are suffering from.
I think you say in your book how you realized that these billion people on average contributed maybe 0.03 metric ton of emissions compared to we Americans, who contribute about 16
like 17 metric tons of carbon per year. So staggeringly more we Americans produce than they do.
But they're on the forefront of getting the adverse effects of climate change.
Exactly, yeah. And I've been so privileged to work with them now since 2011. They're government officials. Some of them are quite young and new to the negotiations. And actually recently, I've been working with some of them to produce short animations, short films that really allow them to tell their stories in terms of how the climate crisis is impacting them at home. So we've done 4 of them, one with a woman from Rwanda, a couple of people from the Solomon Islands, a man from Sierra Leone, and then an inspiring young activist from Nepal. And so in Africa, in the South Pacific, in the Himalayas, what the climate crisis looks like for them in their own words, and really just showcase that, because I feel like so many Americans, and certainly I didn't when I entered the negotiations, really understand that the climate crisis is costing lives and livelihoods right now.
It's not a crisis coming, it's here.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Let's take a moment to watch one of these animations.
That's great.
I feel so proud to be from Nepal, where people live in harmony with nature. But the climate crisis is hitting my beautiful homeland, pushing us beyond our ability to cope. The Himalayan glaciers are melting and feeding the lakes that burst and sweep away entire villages. Downstream communities can lose their lives and property in an instant. Persistent threat is terrifying. Our efforts to build stone walls to protect forest cover and villages can't hold back climate change. As in other least developed countries, most Nepali people depend on agriculture for their livelihood, which makes us extremely vulnerable to climate change, though we have done the least to cause it. My family used to farm, but no matter how hard we tried, we produced so little. It's getting warmer and new diseases are affecting crops. Like many others, we had to move to find new opportunities. Now I live in town, but here too, more intense monsoon rain causes destructive floods. Reduced harvest puts pressure on men's role in our patriarchal society. Drought has forced women to travel longer distance for firewood and water, making them vulnerable to sexual exploitation. Many girls drop out of their school or are married off to cope with food scarcity. I'm afraid and sad that these changes risk our society's stability. World leaders must recognize the loss and damage hitting the least developed countries and take increased action by providing finance and technical support. The vicious cycle of loss and damage we face due to climate change must end now.
We used to cope with storms. We built coastal walls of stone, planted mangroves, and constructed houses on higher stilts. But these efforts had their limits. Now cyclones hit the Solomon Islands every season, powerful enough to cripple our economy overnight. With rising sea levels, our islands are sinking, some completely submerged, and with them, fundamental parts of our history, identity, and culture, trapped underwater, gone forever.
Climate change is often called the biggest injustice of our generation. The least developed countries like ours have emitted the tiniest fraction of the planet-warming gases that drive climate change. Yet, we are 5 times more likely to lose our lives from climate-related disasters.
Salt from the encroaching waves poisons our fresh water and forces people to travel great distances to find water for drinking and cooking.
Our coral reefs, home to thousands of marine species, are dying, and with them, the protein that sustains us. The losses we are experiencing from climate change are irreplaceable. This damage is irreparable. As our water and land disappears, whole communities are forced to relocate.
Some forced to squat illegally, exacerbating tensions between ethnic groups, which makes us afraid we will revisit the violent conflicts of the past that labeled our country a failing state. We are worried about our country's future. Recognizing our deep and personal losses, governments must prioritize the climate crisis and agree a clear plan to address loss and damage that provides desperately needed support through finance and technology.
We must avert conflict and safeguard humanity. We cannot let climate change cause more states to fail. We must act now.
Brianna, you are now a senior researcher for the International Institute of Environment and Development. What do you do?
Yeah, so I detail in my story how raising my hand ended up eventually in becoming a researcher and now a senior researcher at the International Institute for Environment and Development. I work out of their London office, and yeah, I spend a lot of time writing. Mostly research papers, but now books, which is exciting. But I focus on policy solutions that government officials from the least developed countries are going to take to the UN climate negotiations. So I get to do some number crunching, which is pretty terrifying. But for example, I know that people in the least developed countries are 5 times more likely to die from climate-enhanced natural disasters than people in America, which is very sad. But a team and I put together numbers like this to give to government officials from the least developed countries so that when they go to the UN, they can make their positions as strong as possible and as backed up as possible. So when I'm in London, I get to do research. And then I get to go to the UN climate negotiations and work closely with government officials while they're negotiating there. And those negotiations happen more frequently than people realize, at least twice a year, if not more regularly, when we're coming up for a big treaty or something.
I was moved by the different personal stories of people involved there who are negotiating to save their countries and the lives of their country people. Your book comes to a tremendous celebration of the Paris Agreement in 2015, and you describe so well for the reader all the different steps that had brought us to that point, with the many different competing national interests, and then finally the nations of the world had agreed upon a legally binding treaty to address climate change.
Yes.
And then in 2017, what happened?
So it was 2016 that the United States elected President Donald Trump as our commander-in-chief, and he very swiftly fulfilled the campaign promise that he had made, which was to take the U.S. out of the Paris Agreement, even though we had signed up to it in 2015, and the U.S. government had been key in negotiating it since I entered the negotiations in 2011, which is when we started working on what would eventually become the Paris Agreement. And for 4 years, the whole world worked to make a treaty that everyone agreed on to eventually be adopted in 2015. And it was a miracle that it was. It was a lot of diplomatic effort by so many and for so long, including the people I worked with. And it was the first time the world has ever had a universal treaty where every country said They were going to pledge to reduce their emissions, they were going to adapt to climate change, and they were going to provide financial resources to those who are most vulnerable, like the countries I work for.
I think it was in June 2017 that the United States pulled out.
Yes, and then, yes, President Trump pulled the U.S. out, and it was so devastating for everyone who had been so involved, not let alone the world in terms of how we work together to address this crisis. The U.S. is the biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions if we look at our total output over the course of our history. And without us, the world doesn't have a shot at really doing what we need to get emissions down quickly enough.
Your book basically closes around that point, but then we get a sense of, well, it goes on, because the work has to go on.
Exactly.
Yeah. Parallel to your story of coming of age with climate change is growing up in Kelso in a rather complicated and turbulent home life. And that was very moving, the way you sort of go back and forth between these two stories. And there are some similarities in terms of the powerlessness you had felt in the home life, and at times powerlessness facing climate change, and yet you were working on both of those all that time. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, and actually it's kind of tied in with that moment that I watched President Trump withdraw the U.S. from the Paris Agreement. I was so devastated, and I just felt so much emotion. And one of the things that inspired me to do was try to write my story to get people, particularly my own people, fellow Americans, to emotionally connect with the issue the way that I did. And as I tried to write that was something different. That was something I'd not read before. I'd never read a climate change memoir before. And as I started writing that, I quickly realized it was going to have to be more than just UN climate negotiations. It was going to have to be personal to me, and why I so connected with all these dynamics that I was seeing, as you were saying. And for me, that really did come from a place of growing up in a violent household, one where the loudest voice got its way. And for me, that centered on dealing with my dad, and just watching. I was writing over this time frame and seeing parallels between how I grew up and how I saw kind of the least developed countries coming to the UN negotiations, and powerful countries like our own promising things and then walking away and leaving them without a future to hope for. And I identified that with that so strongly, having grown up in a house that was violent, and then my dad disowned me several times, which was very difficult for me, to say the least. And I saw so many parallels between the narratives, and that for me was why the climate crisis was, I couldn't look away. I was trying to wrestle with these two things at the same time. And so, yeah, readers really get a sense of that from me in the story.
A memoir is an opportunity for the writer to reflect upon her life. How do you reflect upon yours at this point, having finished this? You're still young.
Thank you.
This is not the end, folks. So you have quite a ways to go yet. What are the learnings or the lessons that you take away from writing this book?
Yeah. There are a couple. And the first was kind of telling this joint narrative of the climate crisis and domestic violence and like the things that moved me also helped me to see the things that had got me through both of those and still give me hope in the crisis we're still in. And really that came across as the people I love and am trying so hard to protect in the worlds of crisis that we live in. I kind of give a very personal insight into ending up in therapy towards the end of the book and trying to like wrestle with all the things that had happened to me over the course of my time in the UN and dealing with my dad. And one of the things that we were working to identify was what got you through, and that for me was so easy. It was this became a love story, a story about my childhood best friend, a story about my mom, a story about my friends I made in university, and we still call each other by nicknames, and just all the people that I love and connect with and laugh with. And when I think of the future that I want, I'm thinking of them and what I would do to protect them and the future I hope we have together. And I know that so many of the people I work with who are staying up all night in the negotiations, that are fighting for their countries and their futures, are also thinking of the people they love, and that's what's giving them hope and drive to keep going, even in the midst of crisis.
You have a moving passage where the delegate from the Philippines is making a report to the plenary session, and at a certain moment breaks down and begins weeping because a super typhoon, Haiyan, has just devastated his country. So there's that sense that this isn't a crisis coming, this is a crisis that's here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that in particular was so devastating because the Philippines is a country that's used to dealing with typhoons. They have early warning systems, they have typhoon emergency shelters. Super Typhoon Haiyan was not only a Category 5 typhoon, it was the strongest typhoon ever. No one was prepared for it because it had never existed before, and these are the types of storms we are now going to see more and more frequently. So his family back in the Philippines had done all the right things. They had gone to the shelters, they had heeded the warnings, they had evacuated, and they died in those shelters. And he breaks down because he can't find his own brother while he's in he himself is sat there in the climate negotiations, and he can't find his own family back home. And that's what we're all working to protect, our families and our friends back home. And yeah, that's the power of the emotion I wanted to get across to everyone.
And I think you do that very well. You make climate change personal. We are experiencing it more in this country as well, with the storms, the tornadoes, and unfortunately we'll probably be continuing to experience it.
Yeah, I dread every summer now the wildfires that we experience here in the Northwest. I grew up here, and I don't remember fires like this, having to stay inside because it was too smoky to go out. You couldn't breathe the air. It's terrifying, and it's not the future I want for my friends and my family.
Just recently, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issued their latest dire report. There's been a series of these dire reports. And it's sort of like they're saying, really, folks, this time we're serious. It's really, really bad. And given what's happened in the last 10 years or so, we probably are not expecting major changes that this report should instill on us. I have to ask you, what gives you hope in the light of these dire warnings?
Yeah. And thanks for bringing up the IPCC's report. I don't think scientists have ever been so emphatic about the certainty of their case and the fact that we are in crisis. And recently, in terms of what gives me hope, that's a difficult question to answer.
Yes.
The people I work with include Pacific Island countries, and recently Vanuatu, the nation of Vanuatu, which is a low-lying country in the Pacific, brought a case before the International Court of Justice, and they basically appealed that the climate crisis would cost them their nation. And that case has been heard, and we will continue to hear more about that. That's the first time in history that's happened. The International Court of Justice has not recognized the climate crisis as an advocate, basically, of harm until now. And so it is just so undeniable, the state that we are in, and the people I get to work with are going to keep pushing to be heard in as many forms as they possibly can. And I don't know if it gives me hope, but it certainly motivates me to keep doing the work that I do and tell the important stories I think we all need to hear, and also just directly appeal to every American that we really have to protect the people we love, protect our friends around the world. We need to vote for climate leaders. We need to protest the current state of our inaction. And we need to divest. We need to get our money out of fossil fuels. And yeah, we just really need to be inspired to do more.
So that raises the question, what can the average citizen in Kelso or Longview actually do to try to make some difference?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have so much power here in America, and I think we don't realize how important we are. As you were mentioning, we emit so much more carbon, so much more greenhouse gas emissions than anyone else, really. And so our actions are particularly important. And what we need to do most is really shape how we collectively are going to live. And so we need big things like we need to elect people who have a plan to get our emissions to net zero and get them down quickly. We are lucky to live in a democracy, and we need to use that power. We need to protest. Nonviolent civil disobedience is amazing. I would not be sat here with you without it. And our country has a long, great history of that, and the climate movement and everyone needs to embrace this. And there are great organizations and opportunities to get involved with that. So please protest, use your voice. And again, we also need to divest. We are the world's biggest economy, and we continue to be. We need to get our retirement savings, we need to get our savings in general, we need to get our money out of institutions that are fueling fossil fuel development. That means asking questions about your investors and with the people who hold your money about what they're investing it in, and moving it to institutions that are going to invest in a future that's safe for all of us. And again, in the Pacific Northwest, we are very fortunate to have a lot of options for that. We've got great options for renewable energy. We've got great options for investing with people who are going to fund more of that. We're very fortunate. So vote, protest, divest, shape our collective future in a way that's going to be safe for everyone.
Good. And you do include a call to action at the end of your book to help us try to find options, what we can do. Okay. So Brianna, you have had quite a life. And an important life, dealing with very important issues. Where do you go from here?
Well, thank you. It's been a fun life. I love the work I get to do as a researcher at the International Institute for Environment and Development. I'm privileged to do it, and I want to keep doing it. But I've been falling in love with writing climate stories. And this started as just kind of a passion project, something I needed to talk to my fellow Americans about. And it's really kind of taken off in terms of my own interest, but also opportunity. So we've got the memoir out this year, and then next year I'll be fortunate enough to release a novel with Disney. It's a young adult fiction. It's going to feature 2 high schoolers in the Pacific Northwest who vie for president of their environmental justice club, and sparks fly, and eventually they're going to fall in love. But it's really exciting that there is this appetite for stories about climate change and about environmental justice, and people really do want to connect with these issues in a way that makes them personal and also opens up what we can do about it. So I'm really excited to get to tell more stories like that.
And I would say that one of my hopes, I guess, for the future is young people, like yourself. Those in my family, all of the young ones are about it and very aware of climate change. So the fact that you will be writing YA novels, which I'm sure they will read because I will get them copies, is another reason for hope. Tonight you're reading at WordFest, and looking forward to that very much.
Me too.
You'll have copies of your book, and you also have this available as an audiobook soon. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, so an audiobook will be coming out in May, and it's going to star the amazing Janina Edwards, and she's going to read it for Audible, and people can get their hands on that next month.
Great, great. Well, Brianna, it is so delightful to have you return to your roots and to share with us your story or stories as we face this crisis, and to know that we're not doing it alone. that there are people like you out there working, and that hopefully the rest of us can join you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.